I guess I've lost my command voice, sorry. Please, good morning, have a seat. We're going to kick off the program here. I'm Sean O'Keefe. I'm a member of the faculty at the Syracuse University Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs and a senior advisor here at CSIS. I'm very, very pleased to be in the capacity to welcome you here this morning for this very important conference. En route to the moon, creating a more resilient civil space architecture. And this couldn't be a more appropriate time. And as the title suggests, the space community is focused on the national policy to return to the moon and continue the human exploration journey beyond. In pursuit of this objective, important developments in civil space have really unfolded over the past decade in particular. It's been just stunning to see the challenges confronted and overcome along the development. The commercial space industry has vibrantly emerged in much more robust manner with new technologies, modern infrastructure, and creative engineering solutions built around the same chemical propulsion technology that launched Alan Shepard into space nearly 60 years ago. Still, we are in the age of sail, and we seek solutions to enduring limitations and risks comparable to those intrepid maritime explorers hundreds of years ago who made exploration of this planet possible. And we're starkly reminded, very soberingly so, that these challenges have their consequence. On this date, 15 years ago, the Space Shuttle Columbia was on its final journey, having launched just 2 days ago. 2 weeks later, we lost Columbia and the 7 members of the crew aboard. The consequences of exploration are serious, and the risks are high, there's no question. 17 extraordinary members of the astronaut corps were lost over the course of our space exploration just in these last few decades. And that's a sobering reminder, again, that this is a difficult challenge. This is not an easy one, no less so than the ones that we saw, again, in the maritime community as the exploration of this planet occurred. But like then and now, exploration has been dominated by the incomparable human spirit. It is something we seek to know, and throughout the course of humankind, we have always overcome those challenges and always overcome those risks and developed new ways to understand more about the world and the universe in which we live. Today we explore the beginnings of this chapter of that unending quest. To join me in welcoming all of you to this really extraordinary day, I think, to really probe that series of questions. Catherine White is here as the Senior Vice President of the MITRE Corporation and the proud sponsor of this conference. Catherine?
Thank you to CSIS and to Mr. O'Keefe for hosting today's discussion. I had already a good lesson in humility when I came in today. I saw a very crowded room for Speaker Ryan. I opened the agenda and found that thing you get when you're at a Broadway show where you don't really get the main act. You get that white piece of paper. That's where my name is. I'm not Jason, but I am pleased to be here with you today. MITRE has served as a partner to the government's civil and national security space activities since 1958. I've not been at MITRE that long. I've been, in fact, at MITRE only 6 weeks. But I did, in fact, start my career at NASA as an intern, as a summer intern for 3 summers. So it is sort of gratifying to be back with you here today. But our MITRE story began with missile defense activities and continues with substantial work on GPS, ground system development, and space communications. I can tell you a little bit about MITRE with fresh eyes because, of course, I have them. And I've been really amazed at the timeliness, at the independent nature that MITRE can bring industry, academia, and government together to address pressing issues for our nation. And that ability to sort of unlock and even accelerate our progress in important spaces, such as ours here today, has been very gratifying and, again, surprising to me as a newcomer to MITRE. Most recently, our work has included focused efforts to strengthen our nation's critical space systems from cyber and other threats. Much of MITRE's work takes place quietly in support of national security, but as the civilian space infrastructure becomes increasingly commoditized and commercialized, MITRE is seeing the civil space architecture become more susceptible to the very same threats that we see in information systems in any terrestrial domain. This is particularly important to consider as space plays an increasingly important role in our nation's economy and security, and that's why today's conversation is so important. Satellite control system, transportation layers, antennas, satellites, and user equipment must be reconceived, redesigned, prototyped, and fielded affordably to enable a more resilient enterprise, all of which must be done on feasible timelines and, of course, sustainable budgets. Now, as a consultant, I've learned the importance and even the power of a great question. And so I think we have not to put more pressure on the moderators or you in terms of adding your questions to the conversation, but at MITRE we are navigating questions like the following. Will increasingly autonomous vehicles with off-the-shelf components change the vulnerabilities of space infrastructure? How do vulnerabilities change over time? What are the right standards and norms for space infrastructure protection with an increasingly diverse set of non-government actors? What impact will mega-constellations and in-space satellite servicing have on the overall resiliency of the civil space infrastructure? And how do we even define or redefine resiliency? How do we architect and engineer protections so they don't affect the cost or purpose of exploration and scientific missions or stunt technological progress? We're pleased to partner with CSIS on these important conversations and questions today and look forward to the insight from the panelists and speakers, as well as your questions and your comments on how we progress in a pragmatic, agile, and specific way forward to address the things we don't know about our collective future. On behalf of the entire MITRE community, we look forward to working with all of you to secure a more resilient civil space architecture, and I look forward to working with and learning with and from you today and as we work together in the future. Thank you and welcome. So now over to Todd. Thank you.
All right, so now I want to go ahead and welcome our panelists to come up to the stage, and we'll sit down. I'm with the dark side of the force. All right. So before we get started, quickly, a few announcements about the structure of the event today. Number one, we're actually launching a new website today where we're keeping all of our space-related work. At CSIS. It's called aerospace.csis.org. And I point that out to you, not just for an advertisement, but of course it is. But also, that's how we're going to take questions from the audience today. So we're not going to ask you to raise your hand, and and every now and then you've been to these think tank events, you get a few people that stand up and they talk for 5 minutes and there's no question mark in there. We're going to try to prevent that. But we want to get your questions from the audience. So what we're going to do is if you go to our website, aerospace.csis.org/questions, you can see it up there, you can submit your questions there. And so for those of you who are watching online, who are not locally in the DC area, can't make it, you can submit questions too, and then that's going to come up here on a screen for me, and I'll know to throw those to the panelists. So at any time during the panel, if you think of a question you want to have asked, go ahead and submit it up there and put it in the queue. With that said, I want to briefly introduce our esteemed panelists here. Immediately to my left is Rene Wynn. She's the Chief Information Officer at NASA. Next to her is Bryden Whedon. He's the Director of Program Planning at the Secure World Foundation, one of our sister think tanks just up the street, Mass Ave. And then at the end here is Zachary Goldstein. He's the Chief Information Officer at NOAA. And so the topic of this panel is threats and vulnerabilities for civil space systems. And we often talk about threats to our national security space systems and how we need to make our national security space systems more resilient. But as we were talking earlier, we have many of the same issues facing our civil space systems. And so, Rene, I want to go to you first. And could you talk for a little bit about how does NASA think about resilience, and what steps is NASA taking to protect its space systems and, the ground infrastructure that supports those space systems?
So, good morning, Todd, and to everybody else, and thank you. It's an honor to be on this panel. This is not my usual geek crowd. We talk IoT and blockchain and all that great stuff. So the flying assets and IT discussions are usually limited to other rooms. So it's great to be here. So to your question, I think it begins with having a full appreciation of your entire IT footprint. And guess what? NASA is filled with IT, software and hardware. It has a blinking light. Some of it gets to do some amazing things, and some of it gets used for nefarious activities. What I've described is both the light side and the dark side of my particular job. And the awakening, and then that goes on to the resilience question that you asked, is recognizing that any IT within an organization or an entity is completely interlinked. So we have our mission, our flying assets. We like to get it off the earth horizontally and vertically. The first day is aeronautics. The second part is this whole swath of corporate IT, which is changing dramatically, as is space. And then the final part, we'll call it our physical footprint in the IT, which runs from ground systems to our HVAC systems. And so if we're storing nuclear propellants, the first thing I think about is the HVAC system. Is it cordoned off enough to not create a ransom or other type of threat on one of our facilities? Fortunately, I watched enough James Bond. I've read enough spy movies to begin to think this way. And so the first thing you have to understand is the interconnected relationship of everything that we do. And space is absolutely no different. And when you can do that, then you can start to take a look at your risks that each segment of the IT poses. And when you start to break it down, it then gets into what we like to call the bite-sized pieces, and it doesn't get to be so overwhelming. And that's when you can start taking a look at the resilience, because it isn't a matter of if, and you've all heard this, it is when is it going to be able to happen, and how quickly can you respond and recover from the incident at hand, whether it be man-made, debris from something else, or something that was intended to take the United States government to its knees. And so when you start to open yourselves up to this, the possibilities are numerous. You've got to bring a diverse set of people to solve those problems at the table, because design also matters in this process, not just the way you compute or the way you compile or something like that. So the first thing is the big awakening, and know that all of your IT is pretty much interconnected. And then when you involve humans into the ecosystem, like myself, they bring in Internet of Things on their wrist, which also creates other threats that you least expect, and all of a sudden you wake up and know that. Alexa is a whole other story and another great opportunity, but I'll leave it at that.
All right. Brian, I want to go to you next. And we often, when people think of threats to space systems, their mind immediately goes to like ASAT weapons that like go up and blow things up in space. Could you talk a little bit about other types of threats, and particularly environmental threats and unintentional threats to space systems?
Sure, and again, thank you for the invite. It's interesting. You invited me to speak on a panel on threats to the space system, civil space. My first thought was Congress. And then I went, well, actually, you probably didn't intend that. So let's talk about some of the other things.
Speaker Ryan covered that
I'm
earlier.
not pointing any fingers at any individuals, just as an institution, right? So yeah, the space environment is a very harsh environment. And that's often something that people that aren't used to the space world are not familiar with. I know whenever I mention to a non-space family or friends, yeah, there's something called space weather. Then what do you mean there's weather in space? Well, yes, it's an environment. It has weather. It's not clouds and hurricanes like we have here on Earth, but there is weather that happens, largely driven by the sun and its changing activity. Puts out a lot of energy, heat, particles, and those have an impact on the space environment, on satellites and other things in the environment. And so when you talk about environmental challenges and threats, space weather is generally one of the first things to think about. And it involves how do you monitor what's going on with the sun, how are you providing predictions and possible warning about potential huge events such as coronal mass ejections and other events that could really threaten a satellite or astronauts that are in space. How do you communicate that? And then how do you design systems that can deal with those events, but also just the day-to-day changing conditions? If you're going around the Earth, you're going to go from a period of maybe in the sunlight, very hot, to a period very cold, way on the backside of the Earth, changing power fluctuations. The systems have to be designed to deal with all of that. The second challenge is there are other things in the environment you have to be aware of. We generally call those space debris, and that includes both naturally occurring and human-generated. It's interesting today, we think about space debris mostly as the human-generated stuff. But back when NASA started working on the program, their program is called MMOD. It stands for micrometeoroid and orbital debris, because the original threat was actually the naturally occurring debris from very tiny pieces of meteorites that's flying around up there, and that poses an impact collision hazard. Today, the human-generated space debris has surpassed that in terms of a threat we think about, and so we tend to focus more on the human side. But the background natural debris is still there. And that's a significant challenge. There I can say it's kind of a good news, bad news. The good news is over the last 20 years, there's been a significantly increased amount of research and awareness of orbital debris as a hazard. And there's been a lot of steps taken to mitigate the generation of new debris through our activities. So we do things like we deorbit upper stages after they place their payload into orbit. We vent or depressurize them so they don't blow up 10 years down the road, and other steps. The bad news is that that's only part of the problem. There's also this existing reservoir of tens of thousands of things up there, some of them very large, that are going to generate new debris into the future. And we still have not figured out what we're going to do about that existing population. So then the final thing I'll just mention is, to add on a little bit what the previous speaker mentioned is, there's also challenges with hacking and interference in general that may not be intentional. So we're all using radio frequencies to communicate back and forth. I'm an electrical engineer, but I study the microelectronics side, and RF is a dark art. It's very hard to understand sometimes about where sources of interference can come from, what things might be interfering with other things, and pinning that down can be extremely complicated. So that's something to keep in mind, particularly as we're seeing competition for spectrum between space and other space things. So I've got a satellite constellation, I want to communicate on this spectrum, somebody else's constellation on the same spectrum, that can be a challenge, and between space and terrestrial. There's been a big discussion in the last 10 years about taking spectrum and realigning it to enable new terrestrial communications, 5G, and some of that is currently used for space. And so that can create interference challenges and risks down the road.
Okay. And Zach, I want to go to you next. Can you talk a little bit about, what kind of threats is NOAA concerned about, and what's NOAA doing to help protect its space systems and networks?
So, building on the comments by my colleagues here, and thanks for the opportunity. This is an honor. As you, Rene, I don't normally speak to folks like this, and not on this topic.
We're generally not allowed out of the comms
Right,
closet.
it's like you're lucky to get a window. I'd like to put in context, I want to answer your question, obviously, and I want to put it in the context, because when people think civilian space, they think of NASA, and they think of commercial stuff, and they don't necessarily think of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So let me explain why we're a little space agency, and what space means to us, and then why our challenges are unique, and actually it's things we've already talked about. First, to understand the importance of space, understand our mission. Protect lives and livelihoods. And it goes from the surface of the sun to the bottom of the ocean. You were talking about space weather. The daily space weather forecast comes from NOAA. It comes from the National Weather Service. It's NOAA satellites that point at the sun in geostationary orbit that tell you that the CME is coming. It's Discover at the L1 point. Thank you, NASA. Thank you for launching it. But we fly Discover. And Discover is 1 million miles out on if you imagine a string between the sun and the Earth. It's sitting on that string. It's staring at the sun, and it's the 30 to 35-minute warning that the thing that you saw coming visually through various spectrum actually has some nasty or not so nasty stuff in it. It's heading for the Earth, and we've got maybe 30 minutes to do something about the power grid. That's the NOAA mission, as well as hurricanes and tsunamis. That's also a NOAA mission. To understand the importance of satellites to that, I just told you about 2 of them. I'd like to relate to you what we call a data denial experiment. Imagine that you don't have a satellite, and what happens? So after Hurricane Sandy, we did a data denial experiment. We ran all of the models, the global forecast model, the actual hurricane track models, and we ran them without the initialization data coming from polar orbiting satellites. Polar orbiting satellites make up about 80% of the input into a numerical weather forecast. When we took the polar orbiting data out of the models and reran the forecast for Sandy, Sandy went up the East Coast, like we all remember, and remember that big hard turn to the left, to the west, that caused Sandy to slam into the New York metropolitan area? Without satellite data, that doesn't happen. Our forecast would have shown Sandy continuing harmlessly toward Greenland. Satellites matter. And they matter to people every day, right? Because that's the satellite. So what do we do to protect that? Our ability to protect lives and livelihoods, to protect space assets by doing space weather forecasting, protect the American population. 2 big threats I'd like to focus on, and the uniqueness of the threats in the context of satellites. So you can't have a couple of CIOs in any room without discussing cyber. It's our #1 priority. It's the thing that keeps us awake at night. If you can't protect the operations, you don't have operations. It's part of the mission. It's mission protection. What's unique about the NOAA situation, perhaps, when you think about what we have to do, you don't want your communications with a satellite being open. You want them to be as isolated from the public and the internet as possible. You want to protect it. You want to physically isolate it. But somehow, every day, every half hour, information from those satellites that contributes to a weather forecast has to make it out to the people. Because if it doesn't, there's no point of having it. So how do you handle the cyber challenge of, on one hand, isolating command and control, and not just the command and control computers, but the computers that you use to generate the products that go into the high-performance computers that go into, it's a value chain, just like you were describing. Ultimately, it has to get out to the people, but the computers that command and control the satellites, the computers we use to generate the satellite products that feed the high-performance computing, the high-performance computing itself, the weather forecasting system, and ultimately, it has to go on to the web or your phone. We get the word out in many ways. It has to end up on the internet, which means it's exposed. That architectural challenge is enormous. Rene, you were talking about complexity. These ground systems which we call IT, are the most complex things that humans create. So how do you do that? And how do you do it when you're trying to do things efficiently? So an efficiency move is to combine things. Why have a separate system for doing email and surfing the web and generating satellite products when I can save a whole bunch of money and have one? Well, I'll tell you, you put them all into one, and all of a sudden, your satellite product generation capability can be held hostage to somebody clicking on the wrong link. So, and unfortunately, that's where we find ourselves, because we, many years ago, we build ground systems, you do it far in advance. You don't build it in a day. So we have all these legacy systems that we have to modernize. And this isn't unique in the government. If you go to any of the other things that Rene and I will go to, you'll hear about it. It's got to be about modernization because you can't secure an old system. We all know that. But the dilemma is that architecture and re-architecting our systems to provide isolation while giving unfettered access to the public is a big challenge when you've got legacy systems. The other thing I want to mention in terms of threats and what we're doing about it. So re-architecture is the answer. But it takes time and it takes money. Nobody really wants to spend the money because everybody wants the next gee whiz capability in space, not the boring thing that's going to protect that capability from the bad guys who want to destroy American lives and livelihoods. The other thing is spectrum. So you were hypothesizing about the demand for this finite resource. When I was preparing for this session today, the staff member I have who leads the spectrum efforts in my office, and I represent the Department of Commerce on the federal government's spectrum management board, said, well, a good way to think about it is without spectrum, a satellite is orbiting junk. It's a space junk you're talking about. If you can't communicate, it's useless. So this isn't a hypothetical. It is federal policy for this administration, the previous administration. It's federal law to identify ways to share spectrum that's assigned to the federal government with the private sector to do some very important things, to provoke growth of the economy, to bring broadband to places where kids can't do their homework because they don't have it, to stimulate the American economy. No one would ever criticize the objective, but it's a finite resource. And moving spectrum, well, you can't do it if you've got a satellite already in orbit because you can't change it. But sharing spectrum, you can try, and that's a new thing. So the first federal agency to try to share spectrum with commercial broadband providers is NOAA. We stepped up. It's federal policy. It's policy administered by the Department of Commerce. We're in the Department of Commerce, so we're leading by example. This isn't easy. There are technologies to figure out where the interference is coming from. We're building a radio frequency interference monitoring system as we speak. Because we already have had an auction and we're going to be sharing. Today, even without an auction that intended to share, we experience interference in our geostationary downlink when the weather's just right and the interference coming from a known source is traveling further than the estimates that the engineers thought it would. This is hard stuff, but we're working it.
All right, thank you. And, I mean, that's a great point that you raise of NOAA and NASA too, having a public mission. You have to be public interfacing. That's a requirement we don't see on the national security side, because in national security space, you can wall off systems. It's never, most of the systems are never intended to really be public facing. And so it's, you can wall those things off, but you guys are in a position where you have to be public facing. It's, it's part of your mission. I want to turn to some questions from the audience. One question, and any of you can feel free to jump in on this one. Are there any specific policies, technologies, or other strategies you can talk about that will help prevent commercial, small, but maneuverable spacecraft from being commandeered in a cyber warfare attack and becoming a collision hazard with national assets? And so, people often make the point that every satellite is a potential ASAT weapon if someone could commandeer, if they could maneuver it and have the good situational
and the guidance
awareness.
and all that.
Yeah, but how do you think about this problem?
So let me start with a bit of context, right? Because in what we haven't mentioned is CubeSats, elementary schools getting the opportunity to launch off of space station, and that which is really great, because then we can look to the stars again and be curious about it. The Navy is now training people to use the sextant for navigation, because GPS is an opportunity for someone to wreak havoc on the government or the military in that. But where I wanted to take this was, how do you do it is remind everybody, when you go to YouTube and you see some of the silly human stunts, and right next to that is how to open a pomegranate, and right next to that is your physics tutorial because you forgot forgot something about quantum physics, and go just a little bit further, and there's a video on how to hack a satellite. And there's not just one. And having viewed a few on my own network, not at work, I would hate to have my own team come and wonder what I'm doing, and learning, they would maybe even be skeptical on that one, is it's not one, it's many. And you know what? This is not an age issue, but these are naturally curious people with a lot more time than I've got doing these videos, and they're right. So when we talk about the risk and rewards of space, we also need to talk about the access to information that the internet has brought most of us. There are still places in the United States without electricity, and if they don't have electricity, last time I did my job without electricity, it didn't go very well. Squirrels can take out uninterruptible power supplies very easily. I guess those wires are tasty. But I point to you some very basic things that we may forget about, but the other part is the access to information can quickly be turned against us, right? You want to help them do well in their science classes, but you also have to remember that they may be just enough curious and just enough maybe emboldened to turn around and create that video and then continue to practice with that video. So as my colleagues talk a little bit more about that, I thought it was important for you to understand that you can learn to open a pomegranate and hack a satellite in about the same half hour. And I mean, that's accessible, right? And some of you are like, okay, I get the satellite thing, but the pomegranate? I'm really not following you on that one. And it's worth the video on that one. But let me turn to you guys on this one, and then I wanna then add another element of, are we thinking about this, and that's supply chain management, and what does that mean for us? But let me turn to you guys with the rest of this.
So three quick things. One, a lot of people always talk about, any satellite would turn an ASAT weapon, which is not entirely true. The biggest challenge is, once you've got control of it, how do you direct it to go somewhere? So it's got to be maneuverable. And second, you have to do basically guidance. Most satellites don't have sensors on them that tell them how to target something else that's up there. And doing it from the ground is very, very difficult. We can't predict collisions that are going to happen on the ground. Well, a ASAT intercept is basically a designed collision, and so it's very hard to do that without some special hardware. That being said, there are two things to keep in mind. One, satellites, as you hinted at, are using some of the same IT as smartphones and TVs and cars nowadays. And securing that poses a lot of the same challenges. And there are existing top 10 lists of the top 10 threats to IT, or things you can do to harden your IT system. And a lot of it is getting the space world spun up to that and thinking about that in the design phase. And we've watched this go through different industries, right? The car industry, the last 5 years, has had to grapple with a lot of the same challenges of, wow, someone is hacking our vehicle on 60 Minutes. That's probably not a good thing. How do we rethink how we design cars and design in security from the beginning? Space world's got to think about that. Things like validating user inputs, doing authenticated messaging, all these common things that the computer world knows about, because they've been doing it for a couple of decades. The space world's going to have to learn to do that. And then the final thing I'll just point out is that the hacking is a kind of a good and bad thing, right? This is how we discover flaws and vulnerabilities and make our systems more secure and harden them. What it really comes down to is not, is somebody discovering the flaw, it's how does the organization react to that knowledge and make their systems more resilient That's a big part of how this can get, how we can turn that sort of interest and more time than you have into something positive.
Zach, did you have anything you wanted to add on that?
I'd just like to, of all the things you said, I'd like to pick up one. So I get the idea, and thank you for explaining that it actually would be pretty hard to direct one. But you could create a lot of space junk if you're not, right? And that creates problems for us all, especially if, like, our satellites aren't maneuverable. If we know we're heading for some junk, because NOAA had told us so, that we can pull in our solar panels and watch, see what happened, and if something stops, shake it, right? But there's not a lot you can do. So, but what we know well, because you can't build a space system without building a computer with it, we have, as you said, many decades of experience in knowing how to secure them. And there's a basic principle of engineering, right? If you try to make a change late in the life cycle, like after the car is out the door, it's really expensive. And nobody likes spending money on security. In fact, that was one of the talking points in the beginning, was how do we reduce the cost of these protections because they're getting too expensive? Well, guess what? That cost isn't going in that direction. It's going up because the threats are going up. But the best way we can make it affordable is by doing it up front. It's a basic engineering, software engineering, system engineering principle. It's a nonlinear curve of cost over time of when it costs to fix a mistake. Not building security in from the beginning is a mistake. So if there's a way that we can take our knowledge, and maybe even some leadership from Homeland Security and other agencies that actually look at critical industries, or maybe that's too intimidating. Maybe just some standards organizations with voluntary compliance or whatever, but it'd be great if people could learn to think about the IT before they launch something in space.
I think, and too, the question was about policies, and I think you have to be very careful when you go into the policy realm. I think there's strategies that you need to be thinking, because we want to leave our engineers and software developers really open to creativity. What you have to do is make sure they understand that the threats they know today, that by the time they launch, are incredibly different. And so I like to think of it and borrow from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, their framework for the world I live in and Zach lives in, and frankly, I think it applies everywhere. And the first thing you need to do is identify, right? Identify what could happen, identify who's on your network, and then come up with ways to protect, which is all straight risk mitigation patterns, or accepting that particular risk because the cost is too high, the consequences might not be that great, or the likelihood might not be great associated with that. You want to detect it. So you want to know, okay, there's going to be things I can't even imagine today that will happen, but would I know that something was different? And then you would want to respond, and then you need to recover. And so instead of writing policies to tell people what to do, which kind of ruffles people's feathers, at least that's what I'm told about my policies. And that is, but they're designed to spark better behavior and thinking beyond your own area of expertise, and really starting to form collaborative partnerships with different disciplines and different thought patterns associated with them. And that's then when you start to build the stuff in. And I'm also going to add one last thing. The point of legacy IT, I'm actually really excited that we still use DOS, because I am pretty sure the Chinese and the Russians aren't teaching that anymore. So those satellites are feeling pretty good, right? So there's an advantage to legacy. Paper and pen, cave writing, great legacies, they've not been hacked yet. So remember that legacy is just like everything else we do. You have to balance the risk you actually have or perceive, and look at consequence and likelihood associated with it. And please, for my sake, don't throw everything out that's old. I still got a few more miles left in me, as do some of our satellites still flying like Voyager.
All right, we'll go back to programming in Fortran 77.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We have millions of lines of COBOL. I was like, what?
Yeah.
Millions, you said, right? And I'm like, stop counting at that point, because it's probably higher than that.
Fortran's a great modeling language.
It is, and the
Millions of-
compiling, some of the
millions
older compiling languages are still the preference.
I learned C.
I grew up on Pascal. So.
And then there's Raspberry Pi.
Yeah. So this next question from the audience is for you, Rene. How will NASA leverage potential funds from the Modernizing Government Technology Act to further NASA's mission?
Oh, this is I'm gonna answer this sort of as a two-sided question, and it's basically going to give you a sort of a decision approach. My first question is, I'm aware of a number of systems in the federal government need to be modernized. So I have to sort of take an approach and present this to the agency as what's the part of being a good member of the federal government that needs to be, and then do our own decisions within NASA to say, do we have a legacy system that we should put in the mix with some of the ones that more of the public rely upon. The processing of Social Security benefits, your Medicaid benefits, Medicare, the CHIP program, the Child Health Program. Take a look at where those are and see if, one, can we compete, because then you balance the work, the transaction cost associated with it. And decide to do that. Management, obviously, that sit around NASA also have to weigh in on whether we want to do it, because there's, like everything, there's strings attached to that. Mm-hmm. And can we afford those strings? Mm-hmm. So NASA has about 3,000 software developers. Could I, if we decided that an older system, we're not going to use legacy, is worthy of a modernization effort, should we actually do this ourselves with some of the bright people or in partnership? I mean, we don't work alone. We work with academics, and we work with international agencies in that. And so I think I want to open up our conversation to see if we're going to go down this path and ask for additional public money with additional strings, then is it really warranted to take the opportunity away from maybe an agency that doesn't have some of the really strong partnerships that we have and allow them to move forward? And so that's just a little bit of what we're going to have to weigh. It's not just really, I need the money to fix the system, but what makes sense from a public policy, what makes sense from a NASA position and what they're doing with their money, with their partnerships, and then kind of close on that decision to see if we've got candidates that get through that process. But that might be different for other agencies, and it might be different from NOAA's decision-making process as well. But that's been thinking a lot about it, and I want to be very careful with this one, because help from some parts of the government is, well, just help.
Now, the next question is for you, Zach, from the audience. There's a lot of talk about increasing the number of small sats that we use for weather monitoring.
Right.
Are there any unique threats or vulnerabilities relating to using large flocks of small sats? How's NOAA thinking about that challenge?
So we're thinking about it in terms of a threat to what we're doing, but also as a path forward for ourselves.
Right.
So small sats have the advantage that you can develop them very quickly, and you can launch them. And if the costs get low enough, they're expendable. But the problem is, this gets back to the space junk versus being a satellite. One of the big constraints is frequency management. Each of those small sats needs to be talked to and talked from. Anyway, needs to talk to us and we can talk to it. And they can't interfere with each other. And they're going to want spectrum. So whose spectrum are they going to get? We would like to be able to use that in our spectrum, but our spectrum is in demand for broadband on the ground, which is a much more powerful signal than that little candle light that's 20,000 miles up. That's really hard to hear. It's interfered with really easily. So it's an opportunity. It's also, and especially if we can leverage other people's small sats, that's an opportunity. One of the concerns I have about that, the world's full of trade-offs, right? Just like you're talking about the management, the modernizing government technology. And I agree with you, by the way, that legacy is not a dirty word. But just like there's a trade-off in what does it cost to get the money, there's a trade-off in what does it cost to get the additional data, right? So if we rely, if it's a private sector organization that's launching small sats for weather observation, or just, well, it's atmospheric observation that turns into weather forecast, do they have the same security built into their value chain as we do? Or was that something that somebody launched because they thought it was a good idea and, oh, I need an IT system, what am I going to do about it? This gets to Rene's point about thinking outside your domain, thinking outside of yourself. Well, it's really easy. I can access this satellite from home. That's really cool. I don't have to get out of bed. I don't have to go to this secure location to be able to send a command. What a rotten design that would be, right? But I'm not saying people are doing that. But if they can, if the folks who are doing this commercially can find a way to get spectrum without taking away the spectrum we already have and leave us room to get spectrum too, if we can solve that, if they can meet the same reliability, availability, you can't say, oh, well, the forecast isn't accurate today because the satellites we depended upon were out, right? It's got to be there. We're not talking about 2 nines, 3 nines, 4, we're talking about 5 nines. Right? It's got to be there. So if they can meet the availability, reliability, and the supply chain security, which you alluded to, which starts when you buy stuff and where you're buying it from and what's embedded in the firmware that you didn't know was there. Right? That's a scary thought. But if they can if they can take seriously the same considerations we do, it's a great opportunity. And if you can introduce competition and innovation and not constrain the powerful innovation engine that's the American economy by the things we're talking about, if you can do both, it can be a great opportunity.
So, one of the questions from the audience is about, how do NASA and NOAA collaborate with other agencies within the government, with international partners, with commercial partners? How do you collaborate to work on some of these issues that we're talking about here, on sharing information about threats and what's going on in the environment, how your systems are being effective? What kind of mechanisms do you have available, or what else do you need to be able to do to work with other partners?
If we could make a day longer,
Yeah.
we'd start there. Let me start on that one. So there was the Federal IT Acquisition Reform Act, FITARA, actually built on some previous legislation, but was much stronger in terms of getting chief information officers at the table. We represent a domain, and it's not just your device, and it's not just the tech that shows up to fix the blue screen of meditation. And that starts to change the story because, again, you're adding another perspective at the table. So we'll fast forward to now, and so many CIOs are very much welcome at the table, and sometimes I can tell you the table talks about stuff that's going right over my head. It's like, okay, what was that? But fortunately, if you sit next to smart people, you just start writing your questions or Google search when you should be paying attention, but you can't pay attention because you didn't understand what they just said to you. And so that's great. So you get them at the table. It's a different domain being represented, a different set of scare tactics. I mean, my time is in cyber. It's just there. It's actually kind of cool. Delivering devices and text, that's all just great bread and butter stuff, but the cyber stuff is pretty phenomenal in terms of what people can do, and then what you can learn from that to bring back into your ecosystem. So you change the setting at the table, and you start to have that dialogue. Well, then we also have a table. So the 24 Chief Financial Officer Act CIOs get together once a month. And it's kind of mandatory, because if you don't go, they sort of start to call you and wonder where you are. So you do start to show up, and if anything, it offers you the network opportunity. And so a lot of us are talking to each other on a regular basis. And so you're calling and talking to them about your issues that you have and where you share, and that things like this. You just talked to Zach in the green room, and brought up the issue of spectrum, and I'm going to make a note to follow up with him on a couple of things and make sure we have the right people talking, because that's a lot of our job, is just opening the doors and networking it. And then I would point out is that for me, the bounds don't stop within the federal government. So I have a meeting once a year with space agency CIOs, Japan, Germany, France, and then European Space Agency. We keep inviting Canada, but they're not able to make it. So I'm hoping soon that they do that. So again, it's continuing the dialogue. What are your challenges? Exchanging the stories, making sure we're helping each other be successful, because by the way, we're interconnected. And my final point too is I also make it a point to get in touch with the CIOs of other places. Boeing, SpaceX. Yesterday, I had a conversation with Ken Benner at SpaceX CIO. We are one incident away of having to work together. Shouldn't I at least know his name and perhaps his phone number, right? And so if you think about it, is how do I get better at my job? Actually, how do I help my people get better at their job? It's really less about it's less about me and more about them, and more about my colleagues all around the agency, if they're in science or if they're in human exploration or that. How do I connect them up with people that can really help them learn, or maybe we can help them? And if you go about just trying to form all these connections within the world, then the work that you do, the mission that you create for the United States government gets that much better. You never know when and you never know how, but you know that you have to keep making that happen. And so I see that as a key part of my job.
We need like a special hotline for all the space CIOs.
Yes, we have that.
A bat phone. All right, any other thoughts or comments from the panel?
Yeah, all that. And then there's an analogy between the space CIOs and the weather CIOs. So, we had face-to-face conversation out at the supercomputer conference, not the most recent one, but a year ago, with the Australian and UK meteorological organization. Australian met and UK met, and myself, to discuss cyber defense and high-performance computing. We work together, just like in space, you're sharing the same space, we actually share the same data. Because when you do a weather forecast, you're modeling the Earth. You're not modeling the US. So they've got satellites. Actually, Australia doesn't. They get our satellite data, but for their forecast. And we share information. We run the same models. We model the same planet. So we have relationships. I'd like to answer the question we've been talking strategically. At a very tactical level, I don't know two agencies who have a tighter relationship than NASA and NOAA. You launch our satellites. Yesterday, it was yesterday, the day before, we have a agency program management council. We have executives from NOAA and NASA that oversee our joint projects. The geostationary operational environmental satellite, GOES-R, is a joint program. The ground system is a NOAA contract. The flight system is a NASA contract. We don't have that big a budget, but almost $1 billion of it goes to NASA. Because we are customers.
And we had to take a look. So on that point, the Goddard's CIO and his team are working on this. But we had to look at our handshakes between the agencies and if there's an incident, my first question is, there's an incident, who's responsible and who's reporting it to Congress, right? And it just narrows down precisely how do you have to work backward engineering where you could have those incidents. And so our teams, not part of my team, are talking about these handoffs and whose pipes that we are riding in these exchanges when we have these launches and all of that. So it gets down to the tactical. It actually gets down to every little detail associated with it in terms of that. And it's starting to just become part of the bread and butter in the way we go about a launch.
It's how we operate daily. It's how we run our programs. It's an amazingly powerful relationship.
I want to shift gears here for a second. And Brian, I'm going to pitch this question to you first, and then you guys feel free to chime in as well. About a year ago, we did a space crisis tabletop exercise together here between the Secure World Foundation and CSIS. And we looked at not just national security space systems, but we played civil space systems in that as well. And a lot of thought is going in on the national security side about, what if conflict on Earth extends into space? What are your thoughts, Brian, on if that happens, how could that potentially affect our civil and commercial space systems?
Well, yeah, it is if you are in part of any of the national security space discussions over the last few years, or it's even gone into the media now, there is definitely a lot more concern about exactly that issue. And the shorthand is, war in space. But what's behind that is the United States and other countries are increasingly reliant on space for national security and military power here on Earth. And thus that is incentivizing many countries, to look at ways to counter those space capabilities in a military context. And so there's multiple countries out there that are developing we call counter space capabilities that range from jamming and interference to dazzling and blinding, all the way up to kinetic kill instruments that can be used to shatter or destroy a satellite into thousands of pieces. So there's a lot more of that going on now than we've seen in the last 20 years or so. And the bigger concern is that in a future conflict, there's going to be a space component to it because space systems are being used to support that conflict on Earth, and someone's going to want to do something about those space systems. The good news is that what's going on now in current conflicts and most likely to happen in future conflicts is the do something is going to be a jamming, it's going to be a targeted cyber attack, it's going to be what the military tends to call a mission kill that's going to go after a specific space asset and is probably not going to have a broader impact on the space environment. The bad news is that it might. Someone might use a kinetic kill ASAT weapon or lots of them. And if that's the case, then you're talking about significant long-term harm to the space environment that's going to create a lot of space debris and create impacts for everyone for decades, probably, depending on how high it is. And that's going to have impacts for everyone in space, including NASA, NOAA, all the commercial companies, including the military. And so there's something that I have not seen in a lot of those military national security discussions is how does all this impact the commercial world, the civil space world? Are there parts of our national security policy strategy that are taking those into account or it might have unforeseen consequences for the civil or commercial worlds? I think that's something that needs to be taken a little bit more into account. The last thing I'll say is there's another whole discussion of this, which is when conflict or if conflict occurs in space, how do the existing laws of armed conflict that apply everywhere on Earth apply to that? And a big piece of that is discrimination. When you're doing targeting, how do you discriminate between legitimate military targets and civil targets, neutral third parties, and other things? And how do you limit adverse consequences to population and people that parties aren't involved in the war? That is a huge debate that's going on among multiple legal circles right now. I'm part of an effort called the Malamos effort. It's a manual on international law applicable to national security space. It's 30 different international lawyers from militaries and academia that are trying to sort through some of these questions. And the difficulty is we haven't really thought about that a whole lot in the space context. But that's another whole big discussion that should happen.
If I just want to add one dimension to this, and that is that if that should happen, then Zach and I have to prepare for the siege through cyber. Mm-hmm. Because we are a throughput to every other federal government agency and into the commercial sector. I mean, all the internet is interconnected and all of that. So some of the security measures that might feel like inconvenient and torturing our users, some of that we need to do because in the event that there is a catastrophic event of man-made and even hostile, then all of us that sit in CIO positions have to get ready and gear up and do our part. And that discriminating that traffic is really hard because those signatures take a while to backtrace and figure out. And so we would want to yield, if necessary, to our military colleagues to use our own bandwidth pipes in order to do that. But sometimes I can't tell the difference without some of the right tools or even the right people looking at it. I mean, it's not going to be myself, it's going to be the people at this. And so to bring it back, if there's something going on in space, if there's something going down on the ground, on terra firma, we are always at the ready to be able to do our part so that we don't further allow that action to hinder the United States government's reaction. And so I think that's the other piece to remember is when you used to talk about space, we now have to talk about threats, where they are, and what could happen with the pipes that lead to making our capabilities, but then taking our capabilities out. And so it's just a really different thought process. And so I think it's great that you all had this panel to talk about design techniques and all of this, because this is really cool stuff. And it's the next generation, not your father's satellite. My dad worked at Goddard, so his satellites are still flying. And that is, but it's the new generation, which allows the imagination and creativity and innovation to just continue to be sparked. But just remember that the threats continue to evolve. We will never know them all, but if you designed with the bad guys in mind, it's going to turn out all right.
Zach, do you have anything?
I'd like to go back to that other question about collaboration in this context, because you're absolutely right. If we're in that kind of a war, it's a cyber war at the same time. In fact, it might be a cyber war first, because that's the best way to blind us. Right?
Easy.
Do that, and then we might not even see the kinetic attack. And it could come in a lot, because the zero-day threats are bank accounts that the bad guys have. They have them, they store them, and they wait. So what do you do? You're absolutely right. We'll be engaged, but that's where the collaboration across agencies comes into play. You were talking about the space agencies. I talked about the weather agencies. We run a security operations center which protects all of our assets nationwide. We're collaborating with DIA's SOC, State Department SOC, NASA SOC. We're building those relationships today so that when that happens, or God forbid, actually if it happens, we'll know who to call. This is what we're seeing. What are you seeing? And we have secure links, and of course we work with DHS, US CERT. Those you don't want to build those relationships. That's why we do exercises. I also run Homeland Security for NOAA. We do exercises so that the first time you meet the person you're going to work with isn't in the event, because that personal relationship is the most important thing you can do. And it's not just, and it's within government. We actually fly a defense meteorological satellite, so we have a very strong relationship with DoD too. But it's not just government, it's also in the private sector. And I'm reminded of the other question we got earlier about all these people launching satellites and how do you secure them. And I mentioned DHS, and thank you, Rene, for bringing up NIST. I would like to put a plug in, since I work for the Department of Commerce. There's a really good guide from NIST that's targeted at the private sector. Read it. Read it, and read it early. Don't read it after you've built the system. Read it before you build the system, because otherwise you can't afford to think about anybody other than yourself.
And Brian, didn't you guys put out a manual?
Well, we do. So we have, we call it the Handbook for New Actors in Space, and it's sort of a welcome to the club guide. We travel a lot of international circles, some of the new space commercial actors, and we've often found ourselves in a situation in the last several years of, congratulations, you've got a satellite, thank you. And then wondering, would you understand kind of the rules of the club, right? And kind of how do you be a responsible player? So our handbook is, it's not very big, it's maybe 120 pages, and it talks about the big international frameworks and treaties and perspectives, national law and policy, and then space operations. How do you go from building through launching through operations, end of life? And it's sort of an introduction to a lot of those different topics. I'm pretty sure we include a little bit of cyber in there. I'm not 100% positive.
We can help.
Version 2, right?
All right. So our time is up for this panel. Please join me in thanking these panelists for such a great discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you. And as they exit the stage, I'll ask all of you to keep your seats as we transition to our next portion of the agenda. As we get set up here on stage, one of the things we're going to do today is we've got 3 different, what we're calling lightning talks planned, where people are going to give short presentations on targeted topics. They're really great. We're not doing Q&A with them. But our first lightning talk up next is Dr. John Betts. He's a fellow at the MITRE Corporation. So John, take the stage.
And we need to start on slide 1, please. So thank you and good morning. I was asked to talk about, and you can start it, I was asked to talk about how cooperation on civil sat-nav during this century could provide some lessons for other aspects of civil space. And also, robust use of sat-nav is important for space users as well as terrestrial users. So this is a rigorous lightning talk, 10 slides at exactly 30 seconds per slide, automatically timed, no ticker. We're talking about an extensive set of slides of signals from many sat-nav systems, as illustrated on this graphic. Let's find out if the timing works. There we go. Over the past 2 decades, sat-nav has grown in many ways. At the turn of the century, there was only GPS and GLONASS had only a few functional satellites. Receivers were expensive and rare for professionals or geeks. Now there are 4 global systems and 3 regional systems either fully operating or being deployed, along with augmentations. Count how many receivers you own in your mobile device, your computer, your car, your boat. Look at the amazing innovation in how navigation and timing information is being used. As this growth occurred during this century, there are many challenges to face, summarized here. How could hundreds of signals share limited frequency spectrum? How could more than 100 satellites operate in similar orbital regimes? Would signals work together? Would systems work together? Would system operators work together? How could dual use, civil and military, be addressed? What would be the effect on signals whose received power levels are less than a millionth of a billionth of a watt? This is a success story of how technical innovations and international cooperation combine to meet these challenges, how the U.S. established the objectives shown here and played a leading role in achieving sat-nav cooperation, how new signal design concepts and cooperation have achieved shared spectrum with interoperability and compatibility, how cooperation is producing transparency. It's about vision, innovation, persistence, and relationships. For more than 150 years, the ITU has been a forum for standardizing communications and sharing spectrum. Limited radio spectrum, concerns about interference, and ITU requirements for spectrum coordination were catalysts for technical meetings between sat-nav system operators. These grew into working groups aimed at collaboration beyond what the ITU required, then expanded into multilateral forums for information sharing and cooperation. When I drew this graphic 10 years ago, it was a vision. Most of the sat-nav systems represented here existed only in PowerPoint. The efforts described in this talk, combined with receiver innovations, are well on the way to achieving this vision. Your mobile device today uses signals from many of these systems. Sat-nav receivers used in other applications are moving in this direction as well. When receivers competently process all these signals, users can benefit in many ways from the resulting diversity. GPS is often compared to the internet, and here's a twist on that comparison. Like the early internet, early GPS was amazing technology developed and used by well-meaning people. Receivers would use almost any apparently valid signal to get enough measurements, and receivers were specified, designed, tested, and sustained like radios, even though they had thousands of lines of software. These perspectives are no longer valid, but the devices we use and rely upon have not yet transitioned to 20th to 21st century perspectives. We know how to get from the current situation to assured position, velocity, and time, or PVT. We know how to get more robustness in sat-nav signals and how we use them. We know how to introduce and exploit redundancy in sources of PVT. We know how to remove threats, or at least place threats at risk. There are steps that service providers need to take and improvements needed in user equipment. There are multiple dimensions of diversity and promising alternative technologies that can help fill the remaining gaps. Unfortunately, there are users today like this ostrich, threatened but not realizing it. Most threats to sat-nav are actually to sat-nav receivers. There are common sense things to do, including capabilities that you should be demanding in your user equipment. No longer can you treat sat-nav as a commodity. You need to be a smart buyer of sat-nav technology. If you're not demanding these capabilities in your user equipment, it's time to start. So here are some things to think about in your work on civil space. Have you listed the right specific objectives? Who's going to lead internationally? What are the right forums? How can technological advances help? While threats and vulnerabilities shouldn't be exaggerated, are you addressing them adequately? How can you be prepared to benefit from SatNav in launch and on-orbit operations while not being fragile or vulnerable? I hope this lightning talk has stimulated you to think about these questions and their answers, not only today, but in the future.
All right, and now we're going to take a quick coffee break, and we'll assemble back in here at 11:30 for the acting NASA administrator, Lightfoot. Thank you.